This video is about histograms. Basically, I'm going to show you how to interpret them and how best to use them in your digital image capture. So this first image right here is actually the screen off of a Canon camera to kind of give you an idea of what the histogram on the back of your camera looks like. You have basically the photograph you've just captured right here, and then you have your red, green, and blue channels right there. Here you have your luminosity histogram, and this basically just refers to brightness. This is just the general luminosity or brightness. This histogram right here is the one from Photoshop, and it's basically the same thing as this. Now, to understand a histogram, let's look at this image, which goes from black to pure white. And this is a grayscale for the most part. You have every tone in here that you need from pure black to pure white. Notice the histogram. The way you interpret a histogram is the left wall is your shadows and the right wall is your highlights. If ever the histogram or the data here is hitting the wall on either end, you are clipping. And what this tells us right now is that the highlights are clipping a little tiny bit and the blacks are clipping a little tiny bit, and that means we won't have any detail in those areas. Then the height of each area in here, what this really is made up of first is black through all the shades of gray until you hit white. And then this indicates how much of each tone there is within the image. So we've got a lot of black, we've got a lot of white, but we've got less of these gray tones here. If ever your histogram spikes off the top, that's not really a big deal because it's just telling you you got a lot of that information. So here is another black and white chart. Now if you look at the histogram here, it's hitting the wall on the black side, it's hitting the wall on the white side, and it's right smack in the middle because this is 18% gray, halfway between black and white. So we got a big spike here, and a big spike here, and a big spike here. But what this also tells us is we have nothing between black and 18% gray in this image. That's because it's abrupt. There's none of the gray tones that would be between black and 18% or 18% and white. So that's why we have a histogram that has basically 3 spikes in it. So now let's just look at a normal image and interpret it. This is the perfect histogram for this image. We've got full range all the way from black to white within the image. So probably somewhere in here is black, and then of course we have white highlights on these flowers, and we have a full tonal range exposure of this image, meaning this is a perfect exposure. And this is how a histogram should or could look. They're going to come in all shapes and sizes. There's no perfect histogram other than the histogram for the image you're concerned about. You want the perfect histogram for that image. So now let's take a look at this image. Getting ready to photograph snowshoeing, so I was doing some test shots, and what we have is we don't have white snow, we have gray snow. If you look here in the histogram, we're only interested in the luminosity part, which is the gray. We're not hitting the wall, so we don't have any pitch blacks, we've got detail. But our whites, which are this area, are far from being close to the wall. So that's what makes these, or this section of the histogram in here, the white section, really end up being more gray, is because it was not the proper exposure for this scene. It should look more like this, pushing the white areas closer to the wall. Now if they hit the wall, you wouldn't have this detail that you have here. So just because it's not hitting the wall doesn't mean it's not a proper exposure for the scene. Snow should be white, but it's okay here if this is still a little bit gray, and that maintains this detail here. So now let's look at another histogram. This is a proper exposure for this cowboy photographed in the studio against a black background. Look how much black we have here in the histogram. Lots of it. There's a lot of dark tones in here. But we also have some highlight tones right here on his face and his neck. That's this little bit right down here, just barely touching the wall, but not clipping or losing any detail. So this is a proper histogram for this scene. So the point I'm trying to make here is you need to look at your image and evaluate what kind of tones do you have in it. Do you have bright tones, dark tones, or middle tones, or everything in between? You want to achieve a histogram that's going to maintain the detail in all those areas. So here's a studio portrait. This is a test shot before I actually photographed this young lady. And the test shot was way overexposed. So look at the histogram. Total slam against the wall here. This is the white background that's climbing up and down the wall here. And this is the rest of the detail. The darkest tone in the picture is just about around that middle gray that we saw a little bit ago, which is going to be this tone and this tone. So obviously an improper exposure here. Here is the normal exposure. What we're looking at here is we got a perfect skin tone. This is where we want this to be. The white background is not pure white, and that's very difficult to achieve when your subject is standing on it. You have to do that really in post-production for a photo like this where they're standing on the white background. So here is all that white. It's kind of going off the top, but that's no big deal. It just tells us there's a lot of it in there. And it's more in the gray section down here than closer to the wall. The blacks, which are in here, have not quite touched the wall, and that means they are black with detail remaining in the black areas. Here's a portrait in the studio. Now when you look at this histogram, you think, oh, it's perfect. It's between both walls. That means I'm not clipping anything. But does that look perfect? Of course it doesn't. Her skin is washed out. Her skin is probably in this area of the histogram, right in here. It should be more in the middle for a proper skin tone. So now we have just the opposite, a really dark picture. And notice how everything went towards the shadows. Her face tone is probably right in here, this area, because it's really the brightest part of the picture. Now, here is a more perfect picture, or I should say perfect histogram. Let's go back one. Notice how we're flattened out in the face area here. Not a lot there. But then when we go to the proper one, all of a sudden we have a lot more of the proper skin tone here. Keep in mind, there's no white in here. Now let's take a look at some outdoor flash pictures. I would say that this is a perfect histogram for this scene, outdoors. Not a lot of contrast, so there's not a pitch black and there's not a pure white. And we have a good skin tone here. And that's going to be this area right in here. So once again, this is a perfect picture with a full histogram because it has a wide dynamic range. It's got almost black, it's got almost white, and it's stretched across the histogram perfectly. Now we go to the next one. Here it's overexposed, and so what we've done is we've moved her face closer to white. That's going to be this area right in here. Go back and look at the previous one. Notice this area here. Now we've got an overexposed picture, and that's this area right here as part of the histogram. Now if we go to a darker picture, that area that was up here in the overexposed, right in here with the perfect exposed, is now down in here. So it's a little underexposed. Now, is this a bad histogram? No. You can easily work with this, especially if you shoot the raw format on your camera. Very easy to adjust and make this perfect. You can look at this right now and probably say, that's a darn good exposure, because it is close to being perfect. But this one, for a flash picture, is just a little bit closer to being perfect. And that's the over flashed one. And then, of course, the under flashed. So now we have more flash pictures outside. Okay. Here we have another wide dynamic range. So this is a perfect histogram for this picture. There's the blouse right exactly where you want it. Now if we go to the next one that's dark, notice how everything is basically heading to the left, towards the darker end. The white blouse is no longer white, it's gray. And it's sitting right here because that's the brightest part of the picture. And then we have an even darker picture because there was no flash here. So again, we're in very dark tones. Now here's this normally exposed portrait again. Here's a little thing that you can do sometimes if you're wanting to evaluate your exposures. select the elliptical marquee tool and come in and create a circle on the face. Not any hair, just the face. This is called a face mask histogram. Notice that it's right smack in the middle here. That means this is a perfect exposure for a Caucasian skin tone, right in the middle here. If you're photographing ethnicities with darker skin tones, you can expect this to move to the left just a little bit. It won't be a whole lot, but it might be more in this area here, and that will still be a perfect face histogram. Now, when it comes time to interpreting your histogram on the back of your camera, there's a bunch of things to think about. Here is a food shot on white seamless paper. Now, the paper is very, very gray, and that's because this area right here, which is white, should really be kissing the wall over here, very close to it, but it's not. So this is an underexposure. So if you then open up the proper food shot, in other words, I bracketed my exposure, proper exposure here, notice that we're very close to the wall. So this white still has detail in it, but it's not quite kissing the wall and creating clipping. This kind of gives you an idea of different approaches for your types of photography, whether it be studio photography, portrait photography, or flash photography. You need to be able to interpret your scene and evaluate when you have the correct histogram for your particular image.